I'm Ulrich Baer. I'm Vice Provost at the university and the Faculty Director for the Center for the Humanities. And we have been having this series, and I'd like to say a few words about this. We are but a moment on this bluish marble that spins through space, which is filled beyond comprehension with things we want to understand and know, and also empty beyond belief. The planet proves hospitable to us, and humans have been quite good at trying to make sense of what it means to live here, to dwell, to play, love, fight, reason, speak, create, undo on this planet. NYU Center for the Humanities is a tiny speck on this big planet. The humanities have traditionally been understood as the fields of study and the practices devoted to understanding and being actively and passively who we are, what we are, and what we may be doing here, and generally to fuel and to respond to the urge that humans have to know ourselves. This center, which was founded by Professor Jane Tyler about 8 years ago, supports faculty and students and others in all of these activities. We have the most fun when something unexpected happens here within reason, something intellectually unexpected, and when people start thinking and talking about things that we didn't quite think about before in the same ways. Together with many faculty, some of whom are in the room, students, staff, and others, including Director Gwyneth Mallon, my comrade in arms on this, Yanoula Athanassakis, the help of Denny Valentine, who is somewhere here in the room, Alexandra Martinez, Janina Soriano, and Victor Bautista, they're in the room here, thank you so much. All these people are helping to run this thing called Environmental Humanities and many other activities we do at the center. We support faculty in many endeavors at the university and give a broad range to what they can and want to do, and if people have ideas of what we should support, we listen. We want to support and galvanize the great things that are already happening on this campus and have been happening for quite a long time at NYU and elsewhere. And we want to credit the many scholars, artists, activists, thinkers, writers who have been at this particular endeavor, environmental humanities, longer than we have. So Yanoula and I claim no priority or credit. A lot of people in this room have been doing this for much longer in sustained ways, in institutional ways, and we just want to kind of help find another place where this all can be done. The point is to get people to think about all of these different things into conversations and to invite a diverse and more public and bigger audience to think with us about what it means to be human in this day and age, in this very brief moment that we have on this planet. We bring academics, writers, we sometimes bring academics who are writers, artists, scientists, activists, practitioners, civilians, officials, and others to guide us in thinking about whether the existing paradigms that have been made available by others account for our current condition. The specific urgency of this moment right now has been more widely shared. It's not shared by all, and it's not been discovered in the last few years. And yet there's no prescribed outcome to our talks and the series. We have people here occasionally who don't believe that the mess we're in is as big as other people think, and some who are willing to entertain very different solutions to some of the problems. Some who think they're insurmountable, some think they're not even a big deal. So we're not ready to be confirmed, so please don't be too ready to be confirmed in your assumptions, and be willing and ready to participate in a Q&A, and we'll give you some space, but since time is so brief for all of us, we won't give you all the time, so when you have comments and questions, Una will be sure to make it concise for you. Don't be misguided or sort of seduced by the title of Environmental Humanities. I like it, it's a bit redundant, but I like that. We also consider what makes us not quite human, what's not so human in us, what's inhuman, and those parts of ourselves we can't quite know and will never know and understand, but they make us who we are. I happen to share the conviction of the German language poet Rainer Maria Rilke, who wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, and who was quite an environmentalist. He would have been a complete hippie in today's terms, and an early vegan, and who wrote his first Duino elegy in 1911, which he completed in 1921. And after, in this elegy, where he tries to understand what is the human condition on this planet right now, which, if you think about it, he started before World War I and ended after World War I. And he said, what is our condition of being human on the planet? And after naming the spring and the flowers and the trees and the houses and the mountains and the skies and the stars that occasionally we may glimpse, and the rain, he says, it is our obligation imposed upon us to give a name to all of this. Without naming, without humans attributing meaning to things, I do not believe that there is meaning in the world. There isn't meaning in the fact that the planet lives. There isn't meaning in the fact that the planet dies. So part of the point of the series, at least for me, and I really only speak for myself at this point, is to name the environment properly, fully, poetically, consciously, even in our awareness that this naming shall not last.
Hi, welcome everybody. We're so honored to have Ursula Heise and Rob Nixon here and Yanoula Chaudhuri on the same stage or table. It's going to be amazing. So I wonder, part of me, if the slow sizzle in the room is due to Una or Marina Zurkow's art project, Dear Climate. Part of me wonders if this is all part of a performative piece to climate denialists. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank the Center for the Humanities that's been so supportive, and its entire staff, which is not that large, but has done very big things over the past year plus. And Gwyneth, thank you for running this show among many shows. And Uli, I have to thank you for saying yes to the environmental humanities at a time when there were a lot of no's, even though they were already going on campus for decades. So I've been to a number of talks this week, and I feel like the nicest thing I can do is be very, very short in my introduction. So I'll be introducing Professor Yanoula Chaudhuri, and she will introduce our speakers. So that's my one official duty and honor tonight. Although given that she knows just about everyone and everyone knows her, it's a pretty easy job. So she's Professor of English, Drama, Environmental Studies, and animal studies. She's the pioneer in the field of eco-theater as well as eco-criticism. She helped launch both these fields in 1994 when she guest edited a special issue of Yale's theater journal on theater and ecology. And her introduction to that issue, entitled There Must Be a Lot of Fish in That Lake, theorizing a theater ecology, is widely credited as a seminal contribution to the field. Professor Chaudhuri was also among the first scholars of drama to engage with another rapidly expanding field, animal studies, and she recently co-edited, and is it true, in both in 2014 Animal Acts, I had to check my notes again, and the Ecocide Project. Very busy year. Over the past decade, she's written and lectured widely on two concepts that she's theorized, which are zoesis, and the discourse and representation of species in contemporary culture and performance, and the theater of species, dramaturgies beyond the human. It's such an honor to have you. A collection of her essays on these topics will be out in 2017, entitled The Stage Lives of Animals, Zoesis, and Performance. Besides her scholarly work, she does a lot of other things and wears a lot of other hats, including Dear Climate. And we just have to thank Marina Zurkow, who is so generous that when somebody from UCLA, a colleague of Ursula's, was visiting me and handed me the Lens Lab leaflet, I thought, wow, that looks really familiar. That's my book cover. And it's also the poster that we're using for environmental humanities next year. So we really wish Marina could have been here tonight, but she's a presence all over, and we'll have her at a different event. So as you know, we're in the middle, or some of you may not know, of Inauguration Celebration Week at NYU, and I've been very involved in a lot of it. And so I've had a chance to talk a lot about the inauguration, about NYU as an institution and what's ahead. And all of this is couched in the term of having charges and challenges in the future. And so we together as an institution have to face a number of challenges. So I have a challenge that was suggested to me by a colleague of ours, and that was to find one person at NYU that doesn't love Una. And so I actually tried all week at all the panels. I kept saying, do you know Yanoula Chaudhuri? Do you have any complaints about her? But to no avail. She is beloved. So please join me in welcoming her and thanking her.
Thank you. Now I think I'll just talk from here, right? From the table? Yes. Thank you, Yanoula. That is just a lovely, lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And thank you also for all the work you've done on this series and everything you've done during this inauguration week. She's basically been running the whole thing as far as I can tell. I also want to thank Uli very much for his energetic and visionary leadership of this series and establishing this series. I think it's extraordinarily important that we're doing this and that it's drawing attention to work that's been going on at this university now for a very long time, particularly through the Department of Environmental Studies, but also in many other locations which we've been trying to bring together in environmental studies, and it's excellent to see it extended in this way. Lots of people to thank, but I'll very quickly also thank Gwyneth Mallon for her help on this project, and Alexandra Martinez, both of whom have been very present in all this. So when Yanoula first told me about the idea for this series that she and Uli had been talking about, the very first thing I said was, wouldn't it be great if we could get Rob and Ursula? That was right out of my, that was my very, very first thought. I said, if we're going to be launching a serious conversation about environmental humanities, I couldn't think of any scholars better than these two. Rob and Ursula, as many of you know, are the authors, respectively, of two books which, from my point of view, have been probably the most important contributions and foundational texts for this phase of environmental literary studies. The two books are Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, The Environmental Imagination of the Global, which Ursula published in 2008. Oxford University Press brought that out. And the second book is Rob Nixon's Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, published from Harvard in 2013. These two volumes, I feel, put the field of eco-criticism into really sustained and challenging conversation with critical theory, post-colonial studies, and social justice discourse very widely conceived. Each book offers a paradigm, a paradigm-shifting formulation, I should say. In one case, in the first case, it's the concept of eco-cosmopolitanism, and in the other, the concept of slow violence. So with eco-cosmopolitanism, Ursula makes a very long overdue correction to the hyper-focus on localness and the emphasis on home places that had dominated eco-criticism since its inception as a discourse, and that led many people to think of it as a kind of an extension of so-called nature writing, and the idea that it was being practiced as both a critique and an antidote primarily to the alienation from nature that characterizes the modern life. Ursula's intervention was to insist on the global dimension of the ecological crisis and to identify ecological orientations that would register and respond to the political, economic, and social interconnectedness that also characterizes so much of contemporary life. Most importantly, she showed us how the new progressive critical theories of cosmopolitanism that were emerging in response to the challenges of economic globalization, how these theories of this idea needed to be extended to include the more than human world. As she says, the realm of non-human species, but also that of connectedness with both animate and inanimate networks of influence and exchange. Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence is also, of course, highly attuned to the idea of global interconnectedness as the context for for ecological crisis. As is his second key formulation, the environmentalism of the poor, which refers to all those resistant political practices by which disempowered and oppressed communities fight back against the multinational corporations and political elites who exploit or despoil public natural resources for private profit. Slow violence in Nixon's conception is, and I quote, A violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that's dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence itself, as violence at all. Because it obscures connections and jumbles temporal and spatial scales, and because we live in a mediascape that privileges spectacular and explosive events for political attention, slow violence poses formidable challenges for representation by artists and writers. It calls, as Rob says, calls for new kinds of storytelling and a new kind of writerly focus on, again in Rob's words, the inhabited impact of corrosively transnational forces, including petroimperialism, the mega dam industry, outsourced toxicity, and the militarization of commerce, forces that disproportionately jeopardize the livelihoods, prospects, and memory banks of the global poor. Eco-cosmopolitanism and slow violence have proved to be extraordinarily powerful and generative analytical frameworks for literary study, as well as inspiring invitations for many kinds of artistic, cultural, and activist contributions to the environmental movement and to ecological thought. I personally think of these concepts as foundational for the development of, as I said, this phase of eco-criticism beyond a thematic literary practice to an emergent, multifaceted disciplinary formation, the environmental humanities. And so I'm very, very happy and proud to welcome Rob Nixon and Ursula Heise to NYU and to the Humanities Center. I believe you have bios for both of them in some of the material there, so I'll do this very quickly. Just the high points. Ursula Heise is a Marcia Howard Chair in Literary Studies at the Department of English and the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. She's the editor of the series Natures, Cultures, and the Environment, and co-editor of the series Literature and Contemporary Thought, as well as co-editor of the forthcoming Routledge Companion to the Environmental Humanities. Her latest book was just published, and I hope we're going to get Ursula to talk about it, published by the University of Chicago Press, and it's entitled Imagining Extinction, the Cultural Meanings of Endangered Species. Ursula is also the co-founder of UCLA's Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategies, LENS, which Yanoula mentioned. Rob Nixon holds the Curry C. and Thomas A. Barron Family Professorship in Humanities and the Environment at Princeton. He is the author of 4 books, including Dreambirds, The Natural History of a Fantasy, and of course Slow Violence, which won numerous awards. Rob writes frequently for the New York Times and has also written for the New Yorker, Atlantic Monthly, The Guardian, The Nation, Critical Inquiry, the London Review of Books. So our plan, so again, welcome both of you. Thank you so much for coming and for being here. And thank you to all of you for being here. So our plan is to have a round of questions that we've kind of come up with and agreed to us between ourselves. And we want to make sure to leave a good amount of time for conversation with you all. So I'm going to start by asking Ursula and Rob in turn to talk about their notion of sort of the rise of this idea, the idea of the environmental humanities, a quick sense of when and where it arose, more importantly, why it's needed, what it can do, and also a question that we are often asked is, what's the relationship between this kind of work and more science and policy-oriented approaches to environmental issues. How does the environmental humanities engage with those? So that's quite a lot. It's about history, it's about potential, and it's about intersections. So Ursula, may I ask you to start, please?
Could you pull up just the first slide on my... Yeah, thank you, Una. Thank you for having us. It's really exciting to have this opportunity to actually talk, not give talks, but actually engage in a conversation about this. So my own thinking about environmental humanities sort of comes out of 2 or 3 years worth of conversation about this at UCLA. We did a faculty seminar in 2014 to 15 about environmental humanities emergence and impacts. That was a really amazing event over the course of an entire year, talking to people from around the UC, the nation, and the world about their conceptions of the environmental humanities from very different disciplinary backgrounds. And that has now resulted in the Routledge Companion to the Environmental Humanities. And actually, I think about a half a dozen of the contributors are here. My co-editor, John Christensen, Jennifer Wenzel, Jorge Marcone, Dale Jamieson, and Una Chaudhuri are all contributors to this volume, which I'm happy to say I just received the galley proofs for, so it will be out in December as planned. And so over the course of that conversation, we discussed sort of what is the environmental humanities, where does it come from, what do we want, and that led then, sort of for those of us who are at UCLA to the idea that we would create not an environmental humanities center or lab, but one for environmental narrative strategies, which will launch next month. And if you're in the Southland on October 20th, we're throwing a big party, and you're very welcome to join us. So I think to come right to the heart of your question, what makes us different from the field of environmental studies that has already existed for a good 50 years? Well, I think the main claim of the environmental humanities in its weak form would be, weak focus on what in international NGO lingo would be the social and cultural dimensions of environmental crisis. But I think the more radical and to me more exciting and interesting claim that's come out of work in environmental humanities is actually something far stronger, and that is the contention that what we usually talk about as environmental crisis and then tackle as issues of science, technology, and policy are in fact not that, but are in fact questions of histories, cultures, and values, all deliberately in the plural. And that it's only by addressing them as such that we really stand a chance of solving them and solving them in an equitable manner. And so I think that's the claim that wasn't sort of implicit in environmental studies, and it's also the claim that sometimes I think encounters resistance when you talk to people who are mostly focused on science and policy around environmental issues. Around that general claim, sort of in our conversation, there were a couple of central concepts and points that emerged. So a part of our discussion revolved around the notion of the Anthropocene and the notion that nature now has been pervasively reshaped by humans, even if you consider areas of the planet where no human has personally set foot, or deep layers of the ocean, all of them are being transformed indirectly, at least through climate change. So in one way of thinking about it, a pervasive domestication of the earth and what might follow from that, and what the differences are in the intentional and unintentional forms of domestication of various dimensions of nature. But one thing we ran into was also that that notion of the Anthropocene, which came from the sciences originally, as many of you probably know from the work of the ecologist Eugene Stormer and the atmospheric scientist Paul Crutzen, actually sort of got imported into the humanities at a moment when the humanities were actually very interested in the non-human and post-human. And so I think that field of tension between the Anthropocene and post-humanism is one crucially defining area for the environmental humanities. The question of post-humanism and multi-species communities was sort of a second focus. So the idea of post-humanism, not just in the sense of general conception of our interacting with both technological and natural systems, but specifically also reconceiving the human in the context of multiple species ranging from microorganisms and viruses all the way to plants and animals, and how we think about human cultures and societies in that context, and how we might think about justice, multi-species justice, in that particular context. And that led us to another big area of debate, and that was the question of how environmental issues are intertwined with questions of inequality and social justice, and how we might also think about sort of justice between very different groups of humans, alongside questions of justice that include non-human actors. And then the final really big area that we discussed were questions of narrative and representation. So what kinds of stories and images do we tell about the environment? And how, in particular, do we think about the prevalence of narratives of decline as they've shaped contemporary environmentalism, and what are the achievements and shortfalls of that kind of thinking and narrating the environment, and what might be possible alternatives to it. So those were some of our focus areas. And I think in terms of where it came from, I would say that the idea of environmental humanities is no more than maybe 8 years old, 10 years old at most. And I think it came out of a moment of dual crisis. One, I think a crisis among environmental scientists and activists who at that moment began to realize that, especially as far as climate change, but also other crises like biodiversity loss, toxification, that just that information deficit model of public communication wasn't working, that just pumping more information into the public sphere and out to politicians wasn't actually achieving the results that they wanted. And we saw that very clearly at Stanford among some of the climate scientists, where then there was a dawning recognition that maybe we actually need to talk more to people who know something about history and culture in order to have an impact. And people like Paul Ehrlich said that quite overtly, that this hadn't worked and you needed to think about it in some different way. And at the same time, also I think both an achievement and a crisis in the humanities. The achievement, I think, was that around that time, 10 years ago, some of the major disciplines that had fields of environmental research, like philosophy, history, literary studies, had established themselves enough that it became possible to look beyond the struggles in one's own discipline and the feeling that one was never enough appreciated or taken seriously, to actually saying, okay, well, we are now more or less established. Not that there's not always reason to complain, but that will always be there. But to be able to look across disciplinary boundaries and collaborate with other environmental scholars, both in the humanities and in the social sciences. And environmental humanities is actually an awkward term in a lot of ways, which is why we didn't take it up for the lab, because history, anthropology, and geography, where a lot of the people at UCLA sit, are actually part of the School of Social Sciences, not humanities. And they were willing to buy into it for a year, but it might for the duration it might not be the best term. But then the crisis that came on top of that, I think, was the idea that the humanities also needed to do things to make it clear how humanities research was relevant for public debate. And really all of us who are in humanities and qualitative social sciences, I think, feel that pressure to legitimate what we do and legitimate our getting funding by something more than just giving degrees and fostering critical thinking, right? And so I think environmental humanities is one area where it's pretty clear what the public impact could be. And so thinking about that, I think, was sort of both the crisis and the opportunity that also led to the rise of this interdisciplinary matrix at that moment.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I don't know if this is on.
Yeah.
It is on, okay. Yes, thanks to the whole team. I won't go through everybody for making this happen. It's wonderful to be here, and wonderful to be here, particularly in exchange with Ursula and Una. So maybe I'll respond more to the second point about the relationship to the sciences, and with the climate scientist Mike Hume, who made a very simple statement, but a resonant one, when he said that we live in a world that's both material and imaginative. And I think more and more scientists who certainly I'm interacting with in the environmental studies recognize that. And Ursula mentioned the information deficit disorder, the fallacious idea that if there's more and more data piled up, it will naturally turn the public towards a certain rational set of decisions, not looking at environmental psychology, at the funding of climate skepticism and so forth. But I think, the imaginative realm has material consequences, and it's clearly not a freestanding realm. It's nested in economic structures, in political structures, in disciplines, and so forth. And one of the challenges in the environmental humanities is that stories and images matter, but they matter immeasurably. And in a world that tends to be, or a university setup that tends to be a little bit prejudiced against the immeasurable, maybe, that you have to work to explain what it is exactly that you do. And every now and again you have a phenomenon like, say, blackfish, that can have a measurable set of impacts on an institution, on the funding structure, on the public image of the institution, or Silent Spring having a kind of a legislative trail. But much more often it's a recognition that if 300 million people watch Under the Dome, Chai Jing's documentary on air pollution in China, in a week, that's a significant moment. It's a significant event in a national and actually international discourse on pollution, public health, the environment. The 19th century, the great 19th century poet John Clare, poet of the Enclosures and the Commons, in talking about enclosures, said, I was moved out of my knowledge. And in the university, we're being moved out of our knowledge constantly. I mean, the speed, I think, with which disciplinary boundaries are opening up and becoming porous and provisional alliances are being created is huge. At a deeper and more expansive level, we're being moved out of our knowledge, all of us, by the speed and scale of anthropogenic-induced changes, particularly climate change. Some of us sooner than others. And so this question that Ursula alluded to of inequality is a critical dimension to this, and has fed into much of the activism and much of the creative work around climate justice as part of the broader environmental justice movement. When we think about climatic inundation of communities, we're also living in a world where we're inundated with data. We're drowning in data. And one of the things that the arts and the humanities do is they create desire lines and pathways through that data and allow us to think more deeply about the relationship between the symbolic and the strategic. And there's never been a social movement, including Idle No More, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, that hasn't had a powerful narrative and imagistic component as a necessary but insufficient condition for that social movement's impact on social attitudes. So let me finally just ground this idea of being moved out of our knowledge in two examples, because I think they have an institutional and a practical resonance. One is Zach Kunuk's film Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change. It's a documentary that in a very profound way looks at the ways in which changing seasonal patterns, changing ice density, changing wind vectors have, in a sense, made the Inuit in these communities illiterate in their own environments. They can't track the movements of herds, the places that were markers for where to hunt, of seasonal change, have been so radically disturbed at such speed that this has actually had reverberations through the social hierarchies of the communities themselves. And so that we see that the cultures of nature, if you like, And who's the bearer of knowledge? The way knowledge is transmitted through the generations is actually disturbed by a kind of anthropogenically inflicted new ignorance and a new speed of adaptation that is documented very powerfully in that film. The second example is a group at the University of Exeter in the UK, led by Caitlin de Silvi, who's a geographer, and a host of other people from other disciplines. And their focus is what they call anticipatory history, and it's a spin-off of the idea of anticipatory adaptation, that it's no good only adapting retrospectively to the crisis. We have data, we have maps, we have ways of narrowing the windows of possibility and trying to plan for that. So anticipatory history really was started in conjunction with the National Trust, which is the second largest landowner in the UK. It's a non-profit that owns an enormous amount of land, and the remit of the National Trust is to preserve treasured places forever. Okay, very complex remit. And so what they have done is they have said, well, okay, you've got all this coastline that has been eroded by storm surges every year. Do you invest your finite resources in rebuilding that for posterity ad infinitum, or do you try to anticipate the changes? And so, for instance, heathland and heathland species may be disappearing here, but 20 miles further north, you may have a re-emergence of that species. So trying to and then they circulated these conversations to, I think, 100 different National Trust groups around the country. So there was community participation in the idea of participation, of adaptation and change. And crucially, from an environmental humanities point of view, they were drawing on oral history, on photography, on painting, on literature, to document existing trajectories of change. And so, I think so much of the focus is on the future, and so much of what the environmental humanities brings to the table is understandings through the past that deepen that side of the equation as well.
That's wonderful. The title of our panel was Environmental Humanities and Human Futures, and the point you're making about how to envision different futures is, I think, very central to the challenge at the moment, as is the whole question of the human, as you say. It's human, but which human? What kind of human? Maybe we could now try to, as we plan, specify some of what we'd said by talking about recent contributions that you found particularly, energizing or enlightening. A book, article, artwork, or any kind of cultural artifact or event that feels particularly successful in taking us in these directions that the environmental humanities might go.
Do we want to start with the art or with a theory?
Either one.
The theory?
Okay, go.
No,
Theory.
We'll start with the theory and then
I
go to the
combined
art.
those two questions,
Okay.
yes. So either one.
Okay, let me a couple of things on sort of three. I mean, there's a lot of really great work that's come out, but I thought I'd just pick three that I think illustrate different ways of thinking, also from different disciplines, about some of the issues that have come up in environmental humanities. So one is Mike Hume, whom Rob already mentioned, the book Why We Disagree About Climate Change, from 2009, which is a book that I think is a really, along with, I think, Dale Jamison's Reason in Dark Times, these are the two books that really illustrate most clearly why the pure scientific approach to climate change hasn't worked, and how much of the discourse about it really is rooted in certain philosophical assumptions and certain narrative templates that are really crucial. Kate Rigby's Dancing with Disaster came out last year. That's a book by a literary critic who was based at the University of Melbourne, has now moved to England, who talks really eloquently about ways of representing disaster and sort of traces the history of our thinking about disaster in really important ways, and sort of points out how up until the 18th century, what we now consider natural disasters used not to be considered natural disasters, but human punishments, and traces how, out of the Lisbon earthquake and its aftermath, you get the modern notion of natural disaster, which she argues might now actually become, at the time it was clearly, in some sense, a progress in the sense that it allows you to help victims of natural disasters and things like that, rather than considering them justly punished by a fair God. But she says that now actually the notion of natural disaster might get in the way of our appreciating fully just how much of what we call natural disasters around us are humanly caused. And so she sort of outlines another sort of epochal change in the way we conceive of disasters. And the third one is called The Multi-Species Salon, and it's a collection of essays edited by the anthropologists Eben Kirksey and Stefan Helmreich. And multi-species work is about 5 years old, comes out of anthropology, and tries to look at what we used to think of as human cultures and societies as really assemblages of different species, all the way from microorganisms to animals and plants that we grow for food or that have ritual or religious significance, and to really look at questions of history, memory, social structure, anticipation of futures from that viewpoint. And almost all of the multi-species anthropologists, many of whom come from Australia, are also really, really interested in how some of the same species actually function differently in different assemblages. So Deborah Bird-Rose, who's an anthropologist and philosopher at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Macquarie University in Sydney, she wrote a book in 2011 called Wild Dog Dreaming, where she traces the engagement of Aboriginal and white communities with dogs and dingoes, and sort of traces histories of memory, domestication, and extinction through these different communities. So these are sort of books that have really shaped my recent thinking, and about things like biodiversity loss in multi-species communities on one hand, and then climate change and sort of more local disasters and upheavals on the other hand.
Great. Yeah, I wanted to put in a pitch for Amitav Ghosh's new book called The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And I think a lot of what the environmental humanities brings is ways of points of entry into the unthinkable. And the scale of what we're trying to get traction on is so vast that I think that's one of the roles of the arts and the humanities in giving us places of purchase. So Amitav Ghosh, probably many of you know him as a novelist primarily, but it's a wonderful book of public thought about the insanity, in a sense, of the denial of a climate crisis. But way beyond that, what I think is important about the book is that he pivots the Anthropocene story, the dominant Anthropocene story, away from the European narrative coming out of James Watt, industrialization, UK, Europe, so forth, and he gives it an Asian axis. And so he talks about the importance of that both in terms of the past and the future. And half the world's population, he notes, is dependent on water from the shrinking glaciers of the Tibetan Plateau. The most vulnerable large or medium-sized nations in the world are Bangladesh and Vietnam in terms of climate change. And he argues quite plausibly that China's single-child policy is probably the single greatest retarding effort in terms of acceleration of greenhouse gases and impact on climate. But what he's very insistent on is that the story of technology is not a story of technological diffusion from Europe, but had these many different centers, and that the role of colonialism in places like India and Burma was very critical in actually retarding industrialization. And so that when you get to many of these Asian countries, they are both culpable and involved in the build-up of greenhouse gases, but they're also historical victims, casualties of colonialism. And so it feeds into the question of climate justice. What does it mean to think about a collective responsibility, but also to disaggregate that collectivity and take into account histories of colonialism as well as histories of technology. And he has, because he's maybe an artist, he has two very grounded examples around urban planning and the colonial city, looking at cities like Mumbai and Hong Kong, and the way in which even in Fukushima, in medieval times, there were signs saying, "Do not build here." And he tries to undo some of the hubris of the selective enlightenment idea that we're progressing towards greater knowledge and greater wisdom. And he's very interested in particular in the place of the epic as a form that in some ways accommodated more easily than the novel these vast spans of supernatural forces way beyond our control that we're also impacting in some ways. And he's insistent that the epic is not simply a historical form, but is a form that has existed in many continues to exist in many cultures, and is often informed by different cosmologies that have many different recognitions of agency, geological, biological, non-human, and so forth. So I'll leave it there.
Can I actually ask you a question about that? Because it is a fascinating book.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I found really striking and totally counterintuitive is the way, and also different from Jason Moore and other people who write about sort of the capital scene and so forth. Oh, sorry. Sort of what to me was really striking, I was wondering whether you thought that part of the argument was convincing, that he really sort of tries to dissociate capitalism and imperialism. That he says, capitalism sort of drove, the implementation of the carbon economy and is what causes climate change now. Mm-hmm. But then that really, to me, surprising argument that he makes, that you could, in a certain way of looking at it, imperialism has actually delayed, our reaching the 350 parts per million by retarding industrial development in the colonies, where he says, no, even if we, and I think that is I understand him to be directly replying to people like Slavoj Žižek and Jason Moore, although I don't think he mentions them, if I remember correctly. But so he's saying, no, even if we could get rid of capitalism tomorrow, I mean, that imperialism would still be there. And so he really sees them as not just different, but actually in certain conditions working in opposite ways. I mean, did that seem convincing?
I think so. I mean, he quotes Gandhi, and I'm just summarizing that if our nation of 300 million at that time industrialized the West, we would devour the planet like locusts or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so he has all these anticipatory foreshadowings of thinking in particularly in China and Japan and India that and as you say, there's some friction between the imperial and the capitalist argument. I mean, I think some of that is there also in another book I'd probably mention if I had more time, which is Naomi Klein's Capitalism versus Climate, which is the argument anti-capitalist, or are we talking about the kind of hyper-capitalism of neoliberalism and mergers, mega mergers, the accumulation of power through those forces versus social democracy and so forth?
I'm sure we're going to get questions around some of these, asking us to open these up, but maybe we could just, before turning it over to or inviting the audience in, do the second part of that question that we had thought about, which, because we do want to acknowledge and bring in artworks and literary works that in some ways are opening the space of these new strategies, these new stories and images that we're talking about. I mean, to me, it's interesting that most of the works you've mentioned so far, Rob, were documentaries. Mm-hmm. And that has an interesting tension with the whole information deficit disorder problem. Because, you think, well, yes, make a very good documentary and try to get lots and lots of people to see it, like Blackfish or something. The problem with that is that, it just adds to that. It could just add to that pile, I thought the example you gave was so wonderful because it seemed to be a kind of anti-documentary in a way. It was talking about not new knowledge, but new ignorance was the phrase you used.
Yeah.
Or displacement.
I'm a big defender of the imaginative component of nonfiction.
Sure.
And it's a very big tent. It's a very big tent.
Yes, that's true.
And it includes a lot of really avant-garde experimentation.
And so, I guess some of the artworks,
Where are your images?
Yeah, I had one more image. Pull it up. Super essential. So I picked three, and I'll just do them very, very quickly. And so my own sort of, I'm really interested in science fiction, and I'm really interested in science fiction, particularly in terms of what it might offer, in terms of not so much utopian as optopian visions of the future. So that's a term that comes from the science fiction of feminist science fiction writer Joanna Russ, which is not so much about ideal societies, but what is the better or the best society you can get given certain circumstances, right? And so I'm interested in this, and so there's sort of three texts that I've been really interested in. So the first one is not strictly a work of fiction. It's the new Constitution of Bolivia that was designed in 2008, modeled on the Constitution of Ecuador that was passed the previous year. And I really think that is a utopian document, and it's the closest thing any environmentalist is going to come to actually reading a utopian text with actual legal force. And that was an attempt to reimagine a nation, to imagine it as plurinacional, so as consisting of many different indigenous identities, an Afro-Bolivian community, and equally important for sort of environmental thinking, to actually incorporate the Earth Mother, the Pachamama of indigenous cosmology, into the Constitution. And there were follow-up decrees of the Constitution that actually give the Pachamama legal rights. Now, this is not without problems, and there's sort of interesting tensions in this Constitution between sort of, it's on one hand a really daring synthesis of sort of Western leftist thought and indigenous cosmologies, at the same time that's also part of some of the tensions in that it attributes both, sort of inordinate powers to the state and to the government, in sort of a leftist fashion, perhaps old-fashioned leftist, at the same time that it wants to grant new autonomy to indigenous communities, and that's led to conflicts over the last 8 years or so, but also to the rise of about 15% of the Bolivian population out of poverty, and the conflicts themselves I think have been really, really interesting. So and the question of how do you think of the legal rights of something like Mother Earth or a river or biodiversity? It's not answerable in any easy terms, which is frustrating to the lawyers and legal scholars, but it's also a really interesting problem, of course. How would you actually enforce those rights? How would you start a lawsuit? So I've actually been, I think there's amazing experiments going on in Latin America, legally, socially, environmentally, that deserve a lot more attention than I think they usually get, and where there are actually really hopeful stories, along with horrifying ones as there are all around the world. But I think there is there's something that's really happening there that really deserves cultural as well as sort of political attention. Along with that, two texts that are just texts of ecologically inflected utopia or optopia. One is by the Nicaraguan author Gioconda Belli. It's called Waslala, Búsqueda de una civilización perdida. So Waslala is just an invented name, search of a lost civilization. So where two people sort of take off and look for an ideal place that the protagonist's parents disappeared in search of. And the other one, it's just the last volume of a trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars from the 1990s, by one of our few, a few utopians left standing in the US, where he, describes in 3 sort of epic volumes the terraforming and settling of Mars and the creation not just of a new biosphere with considerable scientific detail, but also the creation of a new society and a new constitution. And so one thing that's really interesting about that trilogy of novels is the way in which it pits that creative, sometimes deadly, very conflictive, but creative generation of a new planet, a new nature, and a new society against continuing crisis on planet Earth. It's an old scheme. It goes back to the 19th century, and science fiction novels, even in the 19th century, sort of juxtaposed Mars and Earth as utopia and realist society or dystopia. But he gives it a really new twist and is very realistic in both his scientific detail and meticulous in his attention to cultural and political difference. So it's not just humans who go to Mars, but Japanese, Swiss, Arabs, Russians, Americans, all of them have very different ideas of what the new society and the new nature should look like. So those are the 3 texts that I think sort of, to me, have really sort of inspired me with narratives that try to work against the prevailing sort of, they're all clear-eyed about environmental crisis, but try to also give a sort of vision of the future that shows solutions rather than just problems and crises.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I just had a few images. This is an image from on the N2, which is the road leading from Cape Town to Durban, just near the Cape Town airport. And as I said, I'm very interested in the relationship between the strategic and the symbolic, and how these memes circulate around the world, and why this particular meme, I Can't Breathe, has surfaced in Delhi, Jakarta, in Cape Town, in Lagos, in elsewhere. And at a most literal level, it's a protest against air pollution. At this particular juncture, you've got a very congested highway, you've got a coal-fired plant, you've got toxicity from industry, but you've also got a barrier wall separating the tourists coming in from the airport with the shanty towns. And so I think one of the reasons why this phrase has taken off internationally is that it speaks at both a very visceral level. Humans, unlike, say, dolphins and whales that have to deliberate in order to breathe, we breathe unconsciously. And when we breathe consciously, either we're in downward dog or there's something constricting our lungs, and we have this ambivalent feeling about breath, which causes panic. But at the same, so you have that very visceral sense of I can't breathe, and there's also the larger sense of the great chokehold of the sky in relation to the immediate brutality of oppressed communities. And so I think there's this kind of multiple valence. And so when this street art by an anonymous artist appeared, it really struck me as a reminder of the power of memes to travel, that speak to something very, very, very fundamental to our being, and to the kinds of struggles that surface around increasing levels of disparity and inequality around the world. sort of on that theme, this was some protests at Peking University, again ostensibly against air quality, but also the component of having the component of being silenced, of censorship, and the literally tens of thousands of protests against toxicity in China have, in many, many cases, been entangled with other forms of social protest against censorship, freedom of speech. And as one person said, to breathe should not be a medical emergency. And in the context of the US, I mean, there have been a number of people like Brendan Mock, Julie Sway, Charles Blow, who have been trying to articulate the immediate culture of police brutality, the broken taillight assassinations, to the wider sort of maybe more elusive issues of structural and slow violence, and how how to maintain the political focus on the immediate brutality, but also connect it to the fact that, for instance, 60% of Latino and African American communities have a toxic dump in them in the US. Okay, and those if we go back to Eric Garner saying 11 times, "I can't breathe," is a statement about his asthmatic childhood in Staten Island, and it's also a statement about the constriction of community.
Great. Thank you all so much. This point that you're making about the ways, one thing I've been very focused on is recognizing the ways these environmental concerns are now appearing unexpectedly in other discourses, or in texts that one associates with other discourses. Because of course texts are very, multivalent, and there's always much more going on. But one of the texts we used for our freshman dialogues program here at NYU this month is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And it's just a powerful, fabulous Black Lives Matter text and call to arms. But what just kind of blew me away about this text was that it ends up with his conclusion about how we should be orienting ourselves and where we should be going is entirely about climate change and about recognizing the connections between, what's happening to the environment and the history of black oppression back to, to the cotton plantation and slavery and so on. And the way that sort of appears and emerges in these moments, I think is to me, that's a kind of a special strategy, this oblique intrusion, the surprise, the kind of surprising encounter with what we, think of as all around us, but that we spend most of our time not thinking about. So we're way past the point at which we wanted to invite people in, but we still do have time, a good amount of time. So I'd like to open this up to comments and questions. And I believe Yanoula has a microphone because this event is being recorded, right?
And also, it's a sign of our mental fatigue. Two things. One is that none of us could come up with a clever joke for Yuna, Uli, and Yanoula's names. Ursula will.
Ursula.
Sure, hers is easy compared to, but none of us could think.
More used than is allowed by law.
I know, but I didn't want to leave Rob out. And then the second thing is that we forgot to thank environmental studies and animal studies, and that is just a big oversight on our part. So we really apologize because they have been instrumental from the very beginning, and we're a team in the true sense. So thank you so much, Dale and company. So please ask questions. I'll come around happily. Yeah.
Thank you all three for a very interesting discussion. I wonder if I could ask Rob and Ursula to continue talking about narrative a little bit. The whole idea of, first of all, helping the science community transition into taking their narratives into the public domain. How did this work for you, some of your decisions in writing your own books? And also, how does it work? How do you mentor students who want to write within the sphere of the humanities about environmental issues?
So I guess two things. I mean, in response to how you talk to scientists about, I mean, there's I think a weak and a strong version of that, right? One is sort of like, we're here to help you bring your stories to the public, right? Which I think many of us are more than happy to do, and that's usually, but that's also one way in which environmental humanists, that's one role into which they're cast, right? I mean, I think all of us have been at these meetings where the scientists and the policy experts sit there and they essentially make up the agenda, and then when they're done, they turn to us and they say, oh, and you know about cultures, help us sell this to the public. And you kind of go, now get yourself a PR firm, you know, that's not what we do, that's not what we are. So there's a certain, I think, reductive conceptualization of environmental humanities on the part of the environmental studies community that I think it's, you know, you want to be hopeful, but at the same time, that's something that needs to be resisted. And I think where things get a little more contentious, in my experience, is when you try to point to the way in which narrative templates shape even the scientists' own work. And so that sort of I've run into with this work on biodiversity, where really I was surprised to find that I started out being just interested in how the discourse about endangered and extinct species plays out in the public sphere and in popular science and on the media and fiction, nonfiction for the general public, but thought that the science would really be very different, and certainly, you know, the scientific databases would be very different. And then, you know, the more research I did on it, the more it turned out, no, it's not actually that different, that the same narratives of decline, the same way in which endangered species come to stand in for certain crises of modernization or colonization that pertain in the public sphere, totally underwrite the scientific thinking and even some of the categories in the databases also. So that's when I think you get a little more resistance from the scientists, because they like to think of their work as, some of them at any rate, it's hard to generalize, there are a lot of different scientists, but some of them are a little bit resistant. I mean, they just kind of know the numbers are what the numbers are, and it's like, yeah, well, but how did you get those numbers and how are you interpreting them? Sure, the data are what the data are, but you know, there's no raw data, right? I mean, you get them in certain ways and you interpret in certain ways. So I think there are these two versions of how that plays into interaction with the larger environmental community. And then, as far as training students, two things. I mean, again, two things, I guess. There's always two things. One is sort of I try to train them to really just recognize default environmental story templates, to know something about pastoral, know something about apocalyptic story templates, know something about the story of the return to the simple life. Those kinds of basic story templates that have shaped environmental thinking in certain regions and at certain historical moments, and to know how they're powerful and what some of their shortfalls have been. But then one thing that we're really also trying to do with Lens, and that's sort of the second point there, is to think about stories that haven't been told in terms of content. I mean, what are just aspects, perspectives of crisis and how humans experience them that we haven't talked about. And on the other hand, how might even existing narrative materials look very different when you put them into new contexts. So I was very impressed by a graphic novel that a bunch of undergrad students at Stanford created back in 2009 called Virunga, which is about, you know, the Virunga National Park. And where they really, you know, started out being interested in Dian Fossey and the mountain gorillas, and then realized, you know, well, we can't do a graphic novel about this without thinking about the Kivu War, without thinking about refugees, thinking about the use of old-growth trees by refugees for charcoal, just so as to be able to make food. can't think about it without thinking about sexual violence and the drafting of child soldiers, and that the result is really an amazingly complex work, both in terms of the substance it took on and in terms of what they did with it visually. So the way in which, there's new materials, but then also just new media and new genres that might change the old stories. Those are sort of some of the things that we're trying to alert students to.
Right.
Yeah, so let me start with the students as well. One of the things I teach, have taught at Wisconsin and at Princeton, is public science writing. And so I'm teaching a course now called Writing the Environment Through Creative Nonfiction, with creative perhaps anxiously underscored. And a lot of the students are science majors, and they have crunched the data, they have told a certain kind of story, and they realize that there's another story, perhaps with more self in it, perhaps with more contradictions in it, with other types of disturbances and epiphanies. And so I find those students really fantastic to work with. And interestingly, when Princeton the Environmental Institute was floating the idea of having more teaching in the arts and the humanities, really the engine for that was the students themselves, because they asked the majors, environmental studies majors, what do you want more of? And they said, we want more film, literature, ethics, religion. Those are the things that they said are kind of missing or underrepresented. So I think Ursula's point is an important one, that we do often have communicative skills. We can bridge publics and movements, or we have forms of awareness about what kind of language and image travels, maybe. That's something we can offer. But there are also ways in which fundamental narratives that we work off are come to be understood differently as having inbuilt perspectives. And I think perspective is one of the things that the arts and humanities does really well, disturbing, unsettling perspectives, creating unimagined perspectives. And if we think even of neoliberalism and the kind of hyper-individualization that is foundational to the idea of the free market fundamentalism, if you want to call it that. And you think in the sciences, where symbiosis was seen as something perhaps more eccentric at some point or more angular, and now, in fact, as a historian of science, Greg Mittman puts it, biology is social all the way through. And the idea of the individual is, in a sense, some kind of construct coming out of particular scientific, a particular slant to scientific theorizing. And so you have Lynn Margulis and Donna Haraway and Greg Mittman and others as historians of science thinking through the history of the individual and the family, and Anne McClintock has done some of this in imperial context as well, in relation to the naturalizing of those categories, and to what extent is the isolated individual and the erosion of public works and public safety nets, and in a time of climate change, particularly distressing and a particularly important narrative to unsettle, both in socioeconomic terms and in biological terms.
Okay.
I have a question about technical aspects of data and the humanities. When you go talk to a Google engineer or whomever creates Facebook, there seems to be, there is a discrepancy between what they do and what humanists may do, and I'm more referring to imagining a world aside from the data, which is, I'm thinking about democracy was a disruptive idea. I wonder if we had the data that we have, or the data analysis that we have, whether we would have created democracy at the time and point that we did. So from a practical perspective, what can we do to teach students or to communicate to them that part of the idea is to imagine a new world, and how can they do it without being discredited by the world of data?
I think do a double major to start with. It is a very good question, and so I mean, in teaching these courses where people are trying to work imaginatively within visual or verbal or forms or both, I'm often sensitive to even disciplinary constraints from sociologists and political scientists, let alone the STEM disciplines. But there is, as Ursula was suggesting, a very broad spectrum of scientists, and Jim Hansen would be an obvious example. People who have argued for greater activism on the part of scientists and are very eager to tap into the resources of storytelling and image making that artists and humanities scholars are generating. And I think also another point that we haven't really talked about but is pertinent to this is what is the place of new types of storytelling and image making in relation to changes in technology. For instance, Anne and I were just at the program or research center in forensic architecture at Goldsmith in London, where you have A.L. Wiseman and Susan Shopley, an architect and an artist, training PhD students from a variety of different national and disciplinary backgrounds in what they call material witnessing. In other words, the technologies of detection from the air and at a microscopic level are changing all the time. And those resources are then used or marshaled in narrative witnessing in the UN, in tribunals and so forth, displaced people that leave traces and things like that. So I think that there is a kind of a syncretism that's happening in some of these new emergent collaborative centers between technological shifts and acceptance of narrative as an important part.
I think you're pointing to something that is a real challenge, and you had asked us about challenges for the environmental humanities, and that's actually something that I jotted down a note to myself about. I said that integration of quantitative and spatial data with close reading, thick description, narrative analysis, genre theory, aesthetics, all the stuff that humanists do. It isn't a done deal. I mean, I think it is a challenge, and part of the challenge is that, of course, many of us are also not really trained in quantitative analysis and statistics that much. So making that bridge isn't always easy. But I think we can work at it. And just add one more example where that's come up sort of in my teaching. So I teach a class that's called Biodiversity Stories, Maps, Images, where at one point, I invite in a colleague from biology who does work on the California salamander, which is an endangered species. And so he's really heavily into genetics and genomics. And so the problem with the salamander is, so there's a few left that are like 100% California, but sometime in the 70s, a guy introduced a few thousand Texas salamanders to use for bait and fishing. And as tends to happen, a bunch of them got out, merrily interbred with the California salamanders, and as everything from Texas, they're a little bigger, beefier, eat more voraciously, and so the worry is that they're going to just eat more of what's around them than the California ones. But and 40 years later now, you have sort of salamanders that are 100% California, ones that are 100% Texas, and then a huge population that is sort of 25% this and 75% that, or 50-50. And so the question is, how do you deal with this legally? So are the hybrids still the endangered species that we listed originally, or should they now be actually? I mean, you don't know how to feel about them, right? It's like, oh, endangered species, introduced species, invasive species, get out, right? I mean, it's that sort of opposed reaction. And so it's a real problem. How do we think about this, and how do we save the few sort of remaining 100% California salamanders? But at the same time, you have the exact same story in Florida with the panthers, which were endangered too, had gotten down to a low level, and so there, conservationists deliberately introduced Texas panthers to bring the population back up. It succeeded, and that's now considered a conservation success. not some kind of dubious mixing, even though these panthers are just as genetically hybrid as the salamanders. So the data are in both cases more or less the same, but the stories that get told about them are totally different, with really different implications for, you know, conservation, for writing of laws, for listing and delisting and so forth. So there's an example. I mean, that was a very concrete example of where, you know, you have the same sort of genetic distributions and data, but you have two very different stories being told about them, where you can sort of beautifully illustrate. To some extent, yeah. Yeah. And there's been, you know, I mean, there's been a lot of writing about the way in which the discourses about introduced species map and don't map onto immigrant discourses at different moments.
Sorry, there are
two. And there's a great novel about this. I mean, Ruth Ozeki's All Over Creation, right? Thematizes that.
Two people have questions. I'm going to let them both ask the questions, and then we can end accordingly to Una's decision. Go ahead. I'm sorry, you had a question.
Oh, jeez. Hi. So throughout the talk, you brought in different aspects of social justice and environmental justice, mentioning oppressed peoples and minorities and how the environment relates to them and their relationships are affected by industry and capitalism. So I was just wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on using environmentalism as a lens through which to view social justice issues. And if we do that, to what degree would positive environmental change be a natural byproduct of the reparations of past cultures and past oppressions? So if we focus more on fixing the damage done by colonialism and imperialism, to what degree will positive environmental change be a natural effect of that?
Thank you. I'm actually going to let Jorge ask his question as well.
I have originally it was only one, but then Ursula mentioned something that made me think about something else. I wonder if you have any comments on this narrative that seems to be emerging all over the place lately about resilience. Urban ecology has become, it's a story about resilience, about species even flourishing in the cities. Resilience is a way of adapting to climate change, even flourishing under climate change, where everything is integrated, the social, the environmental, the psychological, food security, everything. So there seems to be this narrative emerging that in a way is a quick paced response to some of the problems created by slow violence. And the other one was, now that you mentioned, Ursula, what is going on in Latin America, I'm wondering if the narrative that it's, the narratives that are in conflict and struggling there, more than narratives about nature, are narratives about public wealth, about how to understand the role of nature and environmental issues in terms of, and it's not necessarily a thing against neoliberalism per se, but it's the promise of the version of public wealth according to neoliberalism, as opposed to other versions of what public wealth could be.
No, we're gonna. Yeah, I think we should.
Resilience. Yeah, I mean, we actually we had sort of a whole cluster in the environmental humanities faculty seminar, a whole cluster of contributions that we sort of that revolved around decline and resilience. I think you're right that it's emerged as a sort of counter narrative in a variety of different ways. I mean, it's the resilience of communities, but then also, you know, Annette Singh's recent book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, where she actually tries to look at deteriorated landscapes and the kinds of multi-species communities they generate. And how life actually adapts and continues and changes under those circumstances, and of course, you know, it is also an important part of new kinds of research in biology. I mean, I'm thinking here of Richard Hobbs's work on novel ecosystems, by which, the strict sense means ecosystems that humans have tampered with, say like a mining area, and then sort of abandoned so that there's no continuing human interference. And these ecosystems then develop very differently than they don't just go back to what they were before, obviously, but they do develop on their own into different kinds of ecosystems that he and others argue haven't really been looked at enough, that the attention of biology has been too much on original ecosystems. So I think that has been one way in which other kinds of narratives have emerged. And I think there's always this tension. I mean, how much do you want to emphasize these, and how much do you want to still emphasize what was lost, right? So there is that tension. And just quickly, sort of on the second question, I'm not totally sure whether you were saying that it is a debate about public wealth, or it is a debate about public wealth versus something else. I mean, I think it's the latter, because I mean these discourses about vivir bien, I think, are not just about wealth. I mean, they're in fact how you can think living well beyond and outside of wealth, right? So I think there's an attempt there, even though, I think in practice the struggles have been around the continued use of resources, and I don't think any of these societies have found a way sort of out of global markets. In fact, the way that they've lifted communities out of poverty is by using global markets. And so they're not an alternative to capitalism in the absolute sense in which somebody like Naomi Klein looks for them. But they're certainly a very different kind of capitalism. Does that sort of make sense as a very short answer?
Okay, so I'll pick up on these themes and then come back to the first question. No sooner does a word achieve currency than it starts being manipulated by all sides, and resilience is one of those words. It obviously is going to be a necessary quality for many, if not most, communities. But without caricaturing climate engineers, which I probably tend to do, I was reading a while back about a climate engineer talking about cloud seeding in the Midwest and how it would increase the rainfall, but actually decrease the rainfall in the Sahel. But he said, fortunately, those cultures in the Sahel have a history of being resilient. Okay, so rain theft under cover of resilience, and so there are ways in which resilience can be wielded that are very dubious. I'm really glad you raised the second issue of wealth, and I think one of the things that's central to the environmental humanities is trying to grapple with different systems of valuation other than the purely monetary. And because of the vast momentum and spread of indigenous environmental movements that you know a lot more about than I do, one of the things that happens is how is a territory valued in different ways? What are the contradictions? For instance, one obvious contradiction for many people is the presence of the ancestors. That is a value that cannot be very often translated into ecosystem services or something, some monetary worth. It was John Berger who said, only our modern form, only under our modern form of egotism are the dead seen as the eliminated rather than as a community waiting to gather us in. And there is a sense of different cosmologies of being that cut across sometimes, without sentimentalizing them, that cut across and are in contradiction with a purely monetary system of carbon offsets and so forth. To come back to the first question, I think I don't think there's a natural correspondence between environmental justice and social justice. But if you look at the costs of, for instance, I think the WHO recently said $5 trillion air pollution is a $5 trillion health problem for the world and predominantly for the world's poor. That is a massive, if you can make a dent in that issue, that is a huge saving for the larger social good. Similarly, 200 million work hours per year are expended by women fetching and carrying water. That's a social justice issue. But those are difficult issues to make urgent. Just like public infrastructure is difficult to make sexy and urgent and to build a political profile around. But one of the things that is encouraging, I think, in the US and internationally is the broadening of the spectrum of what counts as environmentalism and who is speaking from environmental positions. And for instance, Jordan Imani Keith, an African-American essayist, was recently writing about the fact that in 1964 we had the Civil Rights Act and the Wilderness Act, and they were seen on like two parallel tracks. And how do we integrate them as part of one story that is about environmental justice and environmental goals, and also about the expanding of social justice. So I think there are a lot of places where these connect. I don't think there's necessarily a natural spin-off, but as more and more societies become more and more unequal, and as questions of debt and injustice become more and more, in sense, foregrounded, this integration of environmental justice into what traditionally may have been environmental movements that didn't pay much attention to that is becoming, I think, much more widespread.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there are certain areas where, I mean, they clearly can't be thought apart, but that doesn't mean that they have the same solution always, or that they're not in certain scenarios in tension with each other. So there's things like, like air pollution, or something like, the way we currently do animal agriculture in the U.S., where you could say, it's bad for people and it's bad for the environment, it's bad for animals. So, remedying these problems will be pluses on all accounts. But when you think about, lifting people out of poverty, increasing their ability to consume stuff, increasing their access to energy resources, it's, I think, in a lot of parts of the world not clear how you can do that without increasing the burden on the environment. There may in certain cases be solutions to that, but not always and inevitably. And of course, part of the story with India and China now is that as, levels of affluence go up, the burden on the environment gets bigger. So those are scenarios where I think the trade-off isn't easy, and I mean, they certainly don't easily line up. So I think it's a complicated relationship. That doesn't mean that in looking for a solution you don't have to keep both of them in mind, obviously. But I don't think, I wouldn't use the word natural, that they sort of one leads naturally to the other. I think that's not always true.
Okay. I think Uli came and interrupted. I will do that. Just give me. Just give me 1 sec. So I think that the thing we came to here for a minute ago about the tension, the paradoxes around these things. I think that's one of the things the humanities are particularly available to. Dealing with tensions and paradoxes. I mean, the things that Rob called immeasurable. There are so many things that are immeasurable because they come from this realm of the unthinkable, or from these very large areas. And so I think that we've opened up that area very well. I think I was right when I said to Yanoula that the best thing we could do for Humanities series would be to have Rob and Ursula in conversation with each other. Please join me in thanking them very, very much for their contribution today. Thank you.
I would like to thank Yuna and Ursula and Rob, and I would like to thank all of you for coming. Especially I'd like to thank the students for coming out, and if you're generous enough to allow me to include in my thank you the Department of Environmental Studies at the University, Animal Studies. It's really you who give us the inspiration for this. We requested of convening, and the student activists on campus who we listen to quite closely. So some of these ideas, the unsolvable, unthinkable, fact that you're in the room, we really paying attention. We're really grateful. So thank you to the faculty in the room, the students, and thank you everybody for coming, and thank you for coming out on a beautiful Friday.
Thank you. That just couldn't have been better.